I turned 69 that afternoon. My living room was dressed with balloons and paper streamers, though most of the cheer felt borrowed from the few neighbors who had come to fill seats. I told myself not to expect much. Julian and Brielle arrived late, carrying a glossy black and gold box. Julian held it up like a prize, reading the card aloud with a flat voice, for the best mom in the world. The words sounded rehearsed, almost forced. The guests clapped politely. I smiled because that's what mothers do even when something inside twists. Julian hadn't called in weeks, and Brielle usually forgot my birthday altogether. Suddenly, a box of artisan chocolates wrapped like treasure. It felt more like a performance than affection. I set the gift down, admiring the delicate ribbon. The couple moved on to greet others, their voices raised a little too brightly. Across the table sat Brielle's mother, quiet and overlooked, stirring the ice in her glass. For reasons I can't fully explain, maybe habit, maybe instinct, I leaned close when no one was watching. "These are too fine for me alone," I whispered, sliding the box toward her. "You enjoy them." She looked startled, then smiled faintly and tucked it beside her chair. The party droned on. Laughter, clinking glasses, the faint hum of music. I kept moving through the room, making small talk, forcing cheer. Half an hour later, a sound split the noise. Brielle's scream from the kitchen. Chairs scraped, guests hurried. I pushed through to see her mother sprawled on the floor, pale as paper, the lid of the chocolate box thrown open on the counter. Brielle knelt beside her, shaking her shoulders, sobbing. The neighbors crowded the doorway, and Julian, my son, stood frozen. His eyes darting not to his wife or her mother, but to the chocolates. His face wasn't grief-stricken. It was stricken with panic, as though something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. I stared at him, my stomach turning cold as he looked straight back at me. When the paramedics burst in, I stepped back against the wall, watching them lift Brielle's mother onto a stretcher. She looked so small under the fluorescent lights, her hand dangling as they rushed her out. Guests whispered, Brielle cried, and still my eyes were fixed on Julian. He didn't move toward his wife or try to comfort her. He only stared at that box, then at me, his jaw tight, his face drained. It wasn't grief I saw there. It was fear. I remembered the boy I had raised, the child who used to cling to my hand in grocery store aisles and promise he'd build me a house one day, so I'd never have to work again. Back then, I believed him. I worked 2 jobs after his father died, days at the school cafeteria, nights cleaning offices, because I wanted him to have more than I ever had. I pawned my wedding band to cover his first semester at college. I skipped buying myself a winter coat so he could go on a class trip to Washington, D.C. He used to write me thank you notes, little scraps of paper with crooked letters. "You're the best mom. I'll always take care of you." I kept them all in a shoebox under my bed, but those promises faded once Brielle came. I told myself he was just busy adjusting to married life. Yet the visits grew shorter, the calls colder. Birthdays became afterthoughts. And now here he was, standing in my living room, staring at me like I had just ruined something he had planned too carefully. The stretcher wheels clattered down the porch steps. Brielle followed, sobbing, into her hands. Julian remained behind, frozen. Then slowly his gaze locked with mine, and I felt the weight of it deep in my chest. It wasn't the look of a son afraid of losing family. It was the look of a man terrified that his secret had slipped out too soon. I didn't say a word as the sirens faded into the night, but I knew the silence between us had already changed into something darker. That night, long after the last neighbor had gone home and the streamers drooped against the walls, I sat awake in my armchair. The image of Brielle's mother on the kitchen floor replayed over and over. My house smelled faintly of spilled wine and frosting, yet all I could think about was that open box of chocolates glinting under the light. The phone rang close to midnight. I answered without checking the number. It was Julian. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual polish. "Mom, tell me you didn't eat any." I hesitated. "Eat what?" The chocolates he snapped, then lowered his tone again. "Just tell me you didn't." My chest tightened. "No, I didn't. I gave them to your mother-in-law." There was a pause, then a sound, like a long breath breaking free from his lungs. Relief. But not the kind that eases worry. It was too sharp, too sudden, like a man who narrowly escaped disaster. I frowned. Why does it matter so much? Not even one bite. His voice cracked on the word one. "No, Julian." "Not one," I said slowly, each word heavy in the dark. The line went quiet, except for his breathing. I waited for something else, an explanation maybe, or a thank you. But nothing came. Just silence, as if he was trapped between fury and panic. Then abruptly, the call ended. I lowered the receiver, my hands trembling. The gold wrapping of that box blazed in my mind as if I were still staring at it under the party lights. I thought of how Brielle's mother had smiled faintly when I slid it across to her. I thought of Julian's eyes fixed on me instead of her when she fell. Sleep was impossible. I sat there until dawn, listening to the house creak around me, knowing something terrible had been hidden in those chocolates, and worse, that it had been hidden for me. By morning, I drove to the hospital, my stomach tight with dread. The waiting room smelled of antiseptic and burnt coffee. Brielle sat hunched in a chair, her mascara-smeared eyes fixed on the floor. She didn't acknowledge me when I arrived. Julian was pacing, his hands shoved into his pockets, his tie askew, his face pale. He looked less like a worried son-in-law and more like a man waiting for a verdict. A doctor came out at last, his white coat stiff, his voice lowered. "She's stable," he said, glancing at Brielle. "Still weak, but the worst has passed." Relief flickered across Brielle's face, then she buried it in her hands. The doctor's eyes shifted to me. "Mrs. Knox, may I have a word?" He led me a few steps down the hall away from the others. His tone hardened, almost cautious. "I heard she had attended your birthday party before collapsing. Tests show arsenic in her system. This wasn't spoiled food or an allergy. Someone put it there." The words crashed over me like ice water. I gripped the railing beside me, steadying myself. Arsenic. Not an accident. Not a fluke. A choice. My mind flew to the black and gold box, the elegant card, Julian's frantic questions over the phone. They hadn't given me a gift. They'd given me a weapon wrapped in ribbon. When I returned to the waiting area, I studied them both. Brielle wiped her face and still wouldn't look at me. Julian wore a path in the tile, muttering under his breath, pulling at his sleeve. His shoulders were rigid, his movements jerky, like a man cornered. I had raised him, believed in him, sacrificed for him. Yet the thought pressed against my chest like a stone. My son had wanted me gone. The truth was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was standing right there in front of me, pacing back and forth, waiting for me to admit I finally saw it. That night, I sat in my kitchen, long after the lights of the neighborhood had gone dark. The silence pressed against me, heavy and unforgiving. Every memory I had of Julian began to unwind in my mind, not as I'd always seen them, but as they really were. The last few years replayed, first the way his calls grew shorter. His hugs became one-armed and quick, his visits reduced to holidays, where he spent more time checking his phone than looking at me. He forgot my birthday once then, twice then acted as though I was unreasonable for caring. I told myself he was busy, that marriage was demanding, that distance was natural. But now I remembered the earlier sacrifices, with a bitterness I had never allowed myself before. The night I sold my mother's necklace to cover the rest of his tuition. The trip to California I canceled so he could attend summer law seminars. The years I worked through holidays watching co-workers head home to their children, while I stayed behind so Julian could have everything he wanted. I used to take pride in giving. I wore my sacrifices like medals only I could see. But staring at the empty table now, I wondered if those choices had carved blind spots so wide I refused to see what he was becoming. 40 years of pouring myself out, believing he would never forget who filled his cup. And yet the look in his eyes at the hospital told me everything he wasn't afraid for me. He was afraid of me surviving. I pressed my palms flat on the table, fighting the trembling in my hands. The boy I had raised, the one who once scribbled notes saying he'd always protect me, was gone. In his place was a man who saw me as an obstacle, not a mother. The truth stung sharper than any poison. The greatest danger hadn't been hidden in those chocolates. It had been growing inside my blind faith all along. And that blind faith had finally cracked open, leaving me staring into a darkness I could no longer deny. I drove to Aunt Nomi's house, with my hands gripping the wheel so tight the bones ached. It had always been Julian's refuge when he was a boy, hiding from punishments when he was a teenager, sulking over rules when he was a grown man running from responsibility. I knew I'd find him there. Her porch light was on. His car was parked crooked in the driveway. I didn't bother knocking softly. When the door creaked open, Nomi's face flickered with guilt. "He's inside," she whispered. But I had already pushed past her. Julian was sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing, his skin sallow, eyes hollow. Brielle stood near the counter, arms folded, tight lips pressed in a line. Neither of them looked surprised to see me. I asked the only question I had left. Why? Julian's mouth twisted. "Your old mom. You've had your life. I need the money now. 2 million sitting in your accounts while I'm drowning in debt. Do you expect me to just wait until you hit 90? The words sliced through me like glass. I had imagined denial, excuses, anything but this blunt cruelty. He didn't even flinch. He leaned forward, voice cold. "You've clung to everything long enough. I deserve it. I have a family to take care of. You're just in the way." Behind him, Brielle lowered her eyes. She didn't argue, didn't gasp, didn't even try to soften the blow. Her silence was its own confession. My chest ached, but not from age. From the crushing realization that the boy I had raised, the child I had given every piece of my life to, had chosen to see me not as his mother, but as an obstacle to be removed. I looked at him across that table, the same table where I had once served him soup when he had the flu, and felt something close forever inside me. Whatever bond I thought could never be broken had been shattered beyond repair. I drove home from Nomi's house with tears burning down my cheeks, but by the time I turned into my driveway, they had dried into something sharper. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the wall until dawn. My son had said it aloud, he wanted me gone. That truth had broken something, but in its place, a different strength began to rise. By mid-morning, I picked up the phone and called Elias Hart, the only lawyer I had trusted since Julian was in high school. His voice was calm, measured, the same as it had always been. I told him everything. Not the poison, yet I couldn't make myself say it, but the debts, the threats, the confession. He didn't sound surprised, only said, "We'll start by protecting what's yours." That afternoon, we sat in his office, papers spread across polished wood. Elias guided me through closing vulnerable accounts, moving my investments, tightening every lock Julian might have had a key to. For years, I had believed letting Julian handle small matters was a way of showing trust. Now I saw it had been a door left wide open. Elias pushed a document toward me. From today on, he can't touch a dime. Not without a fight. I signed my hand steady. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving, I was defending. On the drive home, I remembered the way Julian once laughed at me, calling me too soft. I had let it sting then, but now the words echoed differently. Softness had kept him alive and comfortable, but softness had nearly cost me my life. If he had mapped out my death, I would map out his ruin. I had spent decades calculating how to stretch $1, how to pay tuition when the paycheck barely covered rent. That same precision once used to feed him would now be turned against him. By the time I walked into my house again, the fear was gone. In its place was steel, and with steel came the clarity of what had to be done next. The following weeks became a blur of signatures, meetings, and files stacked higher than I ever thought I'd face in my lifetime. Elias wasted no time. He hired a private investigator, a quiet man named Carver, who carried notebooks instead of small talk. Within days, he began delivering folders that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and truth. I opened the first one with shaking hands. Photographs of Julian at a casino table, chips piled in front of him, eyes hollow with obsession. Receipts for high-interest loans signed in his scrawled handwriting. Then came the worst documents showing he had tried to mortgage my property without my knowledge, his forged signature shaky but unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat. The home I had built with 40 years of labor had nearly been stolen from me by the very son I thought I was protecting. Each new folder cut deeper, but also hardened me more. Elias would glance at me across his desk, waiting for me to crumble. I never did. The part of me that once wanted to shield Julian from every consequence was gone. Still, there was one loose thread I couldn't ignore: Brielle. I asked her to meet me at a small cafe on the edge of town, far from eyes that might report back. She arrived, guarded shoulders tense, her usual sharpness dulled. We sat in silence until she broke. I didn't know about the poison, she whispered, her voice splintering. But I know about the debts. He hides nothing from me anymore, except maybe that. I slid one of Carver's folders across the table. You'll testify, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. Her eyes filled with tears. She pressed her hand to her mouth and nodded. I will. I watched her shoulders shake, but I felt no pity, only resolve. She had been his accomplice in silence long enough. Now she would be my witness. And with her testimony, the walls Julian thought would protect him began to crack wide open. I chose the night carefully. Julian had always loved to display himself in places where money flowed like wine, so I knew the gallery opening would draw him like a moth. I dressed with care, a dark suit, polished shoes, hair swept back, and when I stepped into the room, I carried myself like a woman who had nothing to fear. The air smelled of expensive perfume and varnish. Investors milled around polished canvases, laughing too loudly, sipping champagne. And there was Julian across the room, shaking hands, flashing that same smile I had once believed was genuine. His voice carried above the hum, smooth and confident. For a moment, I almost saw the boy I had raised. Then he turned and saw me. I walked toward him slowly, savoring every step, a glass of champagne balanced in my hand. His smile faltered as I drew close, his eyes flicking nervously to the men around him. Hello, Julian, I said sweetly, just loud enough to carry. How's your gambling debt treating you? The words sliced through the air. The men beside him stiffened, glancing at one another. Conversations nearby stuttered, then hushed. I watched the color drain from his face. He tried to laugh, to wave me off as if I were a confused old woman, but the whispers had already begun to spread. I leaned in just enough for him to hear me clearly. You thought no one knew. They all will soon. By the end of the week, the lawsuits were filed. Attempted murder. Fraud. Elias moved quickly, presenting the evidence, Brielle's testimony ready in hand. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, headlines splashing his name across every screen. Julian tried to keep up appearances, but the polished mask crumbled under the weight of exposure. Investors backed away. Colleagues stopped returning his calls. Neighbors whispered when he walked by. The son who once prided himself on control was unraveling in full view of the world. And this time, he couldn't silence me. My voice was the very thing tearing his world apart, and I was just getting started. Months passed, and the storm that Julian had set in motion finally consumed him. His name was printed in the papers not for success, but for scandal. The man who once boasted about deals and prestige now stood bankrupt, abandoned by the very people he thought he controlled. Even Brielle, weary and humiliated, left him behind. I sat in my new apartment, high above the city, a cup of coffee warming my hands. The view stretched for miles, lights glittering like 1,000 reminders that life could still be beautiful. For the first time in years, I could breathe without waiting for the next blow. With Elias's help, I had placed everything I owned into a trust for my grandchildren. Whatever future I had built would be theirs, not Julian's. He would never again hold the keys to my life or the power to twist my sacrifices into weapons. I had cut the thread clean. My days found new rhythm. I spent mornings volunteering at the library, helping children with their reading, guiding women my age who carried stories of betrayal too heavy to share with their families. I told them that silence is a wound, but speaking acting is the beginning of healing. In their eyes, I saw reflections of myself, women who had given too much until they nearly disappeared. Sometimes, in the quiet of evening, I let myself remember the boy Julian once was, the crooked notes promising to care for me, the small hands clutching mine. But the man he became had buried that boy long ago. I had mourned him already. I had no need to do it again. I whispered into the stillness, not for him, but for me. You tried to kill me for money, but you only killed the illusion. I still needed you. The words settled into the room like a vow. I no longer lived in the shadow of his choices. The life ahead was mine, rebuilt from steel and freedom, and it was enough.